Welcome to the His Eternal Word podcast. I am your host, Rakeyia Collins, and the purpose of this podcast is to read the Bible from beginning to end every single year. If that mission sounds interesting to you, I'd encourage you to grab your Bible and read along with me. On today's episode of His Eternal Word, we are going to be reading chapter 16 through chapter 19. So, picking up with chapter 16, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer-la-Rohi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So, commentary for chapter 16. Man, it's such a pivotal chapter, and it's so many life lessons, I think, that come from this particular chapter. The first one that I really want to hone in on is going to be verse 1 all the way down until verse 5. Because here is where we see Sarai basically deciding that she is going to make a way for a kid to come into the world so that Abram actually has a son. So Abram has genealogy because she feels that God has kept her from having a kid, and she doesn't want that to be something that impedes Abram from actually having a son. And so because that is her goal, which if we look at it from just that lens of her wanting her husband to have a son, that within itself, I can say is honorable because he clearly has a passion for a son. We learned that from chapter 15 that Abram genuinely wants a son. And so if he's talking to God about it, as we saw in chapter 15, we know that he's likely mentioning the same things to his wife as well. And so Sarai's want or desire to have a child within itself isn't necessarily bad. However, as we continue to read on, we know that in verse 3, Sarai gave Hagar, her servant, to Abram as his wife. And I love the way that the English Standard Version states this, because I've read other versions of the Bible and it doesn't use the same term, but because it's referring to the act of relations, it's continuing to keep that in the covenant of marriage. And I think that is a very eloquent and a very beautiful way of including that in the word. So now we see that Hagar has taken on the role of a wife. And because of that, if we drop down to verse 4, when he went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. I think that is so pivotal, because now this is what happens in life where you elevate someone to a role that they were never meant to be elevated into. Hagar was never meant to be elevated to the role of Abram's wife. That wasn't her place. She's not meant to be in covenant with Abram, but because Sarai is trying her best to find a solution to a problem, the solution that she found ultimately caused more hell than it did good, because now someone who, yes, is a servant, so she's probably picking up around the house and being there for Sarai. Whenever Sarai needs something, she's just being there for her. And now you've elevated her from that to now sleeping with your husband. And now she has a child, which is something that Sarai doesn't have. So in all honesty, I can see why Hagar looked at her with contempt, because you've elevated me to a position. I've done what you could not do in your position, and you've had this position for years. It makes sense as to why Hagar looked at her with contempt. Now, I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying that it makes sense. It makes sense why Hagar looked at her with contempt, because she feels internally that she's been able to do something that Sarai was not able to do. However, although Hagar feels that way, if we continue reading on in verse 6, we see that Abram and Sarai are having a conversation, and Abram is essentially saying, your servant Hagar is in your power. Do to her as you please. And this is where, for me, things get even more realer than they've already been, because Abram is essentially saying, it doesn't matter how she sees the situation. She's not my wife. I don't see her the way that she may see herself, because she's carrying my child. Sarai, you are still my wife, and therefore this is your servant, the same servant that you gave to me. You do with her what you will. And overall, the overarching theme from these few verses so far is, this is what happens when humans decide to try to fix problems without consulting God. This whole situation came about because Abram did not have a child, and now we see Sarai trying to fix it without consulting God. And that's where this whole thing just kind of went awry. And so because of that, as we continue to proceed, Sarai, now given the green light to do what she feels that she needs to do, which is get her servant back in line, her servant is like, I'm not dealing with this. I don't have to be here. And so we see that Sarai deals harshly with her, and Hagar decides that she's going to leave. So we continue reading on verses 7 through 11, where the angel of the Lord finds Hagar. I just love this. God felt like it was imperative to send an angel of the Lord to go find Hagar. It was imperative that this was done. In the angel of the Lord, I love that the angel asked some rhetorical questions like, where have you come from and where are you going? To which Hagar responds, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. Notice that she did not answer the full question. She certainly answered the piece where the angel of the Lord said, where have you come from? She says, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. But the second half half of the angel's question was, where are you going? Hagar never answered that question, because when we don't know where we're going, because we've left a situation that is certainly not ideal for us, but we haven't stopped to consult God, we end up just being wanderers and just fleeing and not knowing. I believe the angel still sets up the question because he wants her to know and state herself, you are fleeing from your mistress, Sarai, but you're not going anywhere. Like, let's really look at the situation for what it is. You are fleeing from your home and you're not going anywhere. The angel of the Lord tells her in verse 9, return to your mistress and submit to her, which, as we saw back in verse 4, that was the problem, that Hagar, once she conceived, was like, I'm no longer listening to you. I don't have to listen to you. And the angel of the Lord just tells her to go back and submit to her. Go back and submit to her. And he begins to let her know about her son Ishmael and how Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand is going to be against everyone, and everyone's hand is going to be against him. But the verse that I really love, and one of the ones I want to close with, is going to be 13 through really 14, where, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Berlahi-Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. The God who sees. And that's why it is so imperative that we never forget. We serve the God who sees. He sees all and he knows all. And you never need to feel like no matter how messed up your situation is, God knows and he sees. And I absolutely love that. So moving along to chapter 17. Abraham and the covenant of circumcision. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face. And God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, from an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Isaac's birth promised. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, but Sarai your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born to his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those brought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So the commentary for chapter 17 really starts where we see in verse 5 that God has changed Abram's name to Abraham. It is imperative to know that this is important because of the historical context, that in these times, the name of the thing was the thing itself. And so while we haven't gotten into Moses and Moses' story as a preview, when God is engaging in conversation with Moses and he's speaking through the bush and he says, I am, there's a reason why he says I am. And he doesn't say, I am a healer, I am a protector. Like, he doesn't begin to list off the things that he is, because in those times, the name of the thing was actually the thing itself. And so I love the fact that God, before Isaac came into being, before anything else happened, he changed his name to show we're about to go into a shift in your life at this particular point. And so from that verse, if we drop down quite a few verses to verse 17, here is where we can see that God is now talking to Abraham about the birth of Isaac, the son that he is going to have through Sarah. And I wanted to highlight verse 17 because it says that Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And the reason why I wanted to double click on that verse is because I think that's what a lot of us do as humans. We look at the magnitude of the situation through our lens, and we oftentimes forget who we're dealing with. Like, this is the God of the universe. He can do all things. He can do anything. And so rather than just zooming in on our specific lay of the land and our specific lens, we should actually step back and take into account who we're speaking to and allow that to be the guiding light, not necessarily our own perspectives of the situation. The last thing I wanted to focus on here is going to be the end of chapter 17, verse 24, all the way down to the end. That irrespective of how Abraham received the message that was given to him, ultimately he still went ahead and circumcised his family, because that was the initial guidance that God gave him from verse 1 of this chapter all the way down to verse 14. We can see that God is laying out like, hey, if they're in your house, if whether you bought them, however they ended up in your home, they need to be circumcised. And I love the fact that even though we see in verse 17, Abraham is having a hard time believing like, is this really going to happen? We still see towards the end of the chapter that Abraham does exactly what God tells him to do, which is to circumcise the men in his home. And it just really speaks to, we can have our own perspectives about what God has told us, but ultimately we need to get on the bandwagon and we need to do exactly what he told us that we needed to do. So chapter 18. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, where is Sarah your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. Abraham intercedes for Sodom. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there, he answered. For the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20 I will not destroy it. And he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So the commentary for chapter 18, there is a lot going on in chapter 18, but I really want to focus on the piece of chapter 18 that goes from really 17 all the way to the end of the chapter, because it really speaks to the relationship that Abraham and God have. They have an incredible relationship because God is actually one, as we see in 17 through 21. God is saying, am I going to hide this from Abraham? Like, given that he's going to be the father of many nations, and I've chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to follow in the way of the Lord. Like, I'm going to reveal to him my future plans because of the relationship that we have. And I love the fact that this is how, when we are in community with God and we really strive to have a relationship with him, like, these are the types of insights that we're able to get. And as a result of that relationship, we can see that 22 through 33 occur because of the relationship that they have. Abraham feels empowered enough to go to God once Abraham learns about the plans, and he's like, well, God, what if you don't fully find someone righteous there, but you find some people and you find less people and you find less people? And he's just throwing out these numbers like, what if it's 50 and then not 50? What if it's 45 and then 30? And you can just see that he feels confident enough to engage in this dialogue, but also understanding the role that he plays. I love specifically in verse 27, Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I am but dust and ashes. So while he has this confidence to speak to God, he also understands the fact that I am nothing but dust and ashes. And I am taking on this mighty job of speaking to God, and not just speaking to him, asking him for these favors, asking him for him to look upon the city of Sodom, and if he were to find anyone righteous, that he would not destroy the city. I also love the way that Abraham talks to God, because he says in verse 25, far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? So Abraham isn't talking to God off the strength of the people of Sodom. He's talking to God off the strength of God's own righteousness and God being the judge of everything. And I love that, because God is God, and God does not have the ability to contradict his own word. And so when Abraham is speaking to God, as we saw in those two verses, one, Abraham is highlighting that, listen, I am dust. I don't even have the right to come to you and say anything to you. But as we saw in verse 25, because I am coming to speak to you, I acknowledge the fact that I'm speaking to the being that instituted justice, that you are the being by which justice even exists. And far be it from you to do something that is not just. And so that was my big takeaway from chapter 18. I love the way they are engaging in this dialogue, and it's just super helpful to be able to see that Abraham as a human can engage in this type of dialogue with God. And it really puts it into perspective that as we continue to get closer to God, we'll be able to expand in our relationship with him, allowing us to not necessarily gain the exact insights that Abraham gained, but to be able to gain insights nonetheless, because we're cultivating a relationship with the creator of the universe. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found some value out of this content. If you did, please leave me a rating or review wherever you are listening. This would mean the world to me. I'd also love to hear from you on social media. Please feel free to reach out on Twitter at His Eternal Word, the number 1. And also please feel free to reach out to me on Instagram as well at His Eternal Word. Visit our website at www.hiseternalword.com, and I hope you stay tuned for the next episode.